The clock on the wall didn't tick the way a clock was supposed to tick. It wasn't broken. It was just stubborn, like it had decided to make each second heavier, to press it into the room before letting it go. Someone had chalked a thin line across the edge of the table, and the line kept catching the sleeve of the man who sat there. Every time he shifted, the fabric brushed it, dragged along it, and made a soft rasp that shouldn't have mattered. But it did. It mattered because nothing else was happening, and the mind, left alone, started appointing meaning to the smallest sounds. A pencil rolled 2 inches, stopped, rolled again, stopped. A hand reached out, not hurried, and set it back where it had been as if that could keep the room in order. A kettle somewhere behind a door gave a brief, offended hiss, and then settled. The air smelled faintly of boiled metal and damp wool. Boots stood in a row against the wall, their leather dull, the laces tied the same way every time, the knots tightened with the same careful fingers, as if routine could be a kind of armor. The man at the table turned a page without reading it. The paper was thin and rough and made a dry, brittle sound. He held the page down for a moment, palms flat, feeling the faint vibration of the building, something steady and mechanical in the distance, like an engine idling, like a giant sleeping animal breathing through its nose. A chair leg scraped. Someone cleared his throat. The sound was swallowed quickly, as if even that small admission of life was too loud. In the corner, a lamp burned with a tired flame. It flickered when the wind worried the window frame. Each flicker cast the shadows into new shapes. A man's profile sharpened and softened. A hanging coat became a figure standing too still. The corner of a map, folded and refolded until its creases were pale, looked like a mouth that couldn't decide whether to speak. Across the room, a young runner, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, kept checking his watch, not openly, not in a way that begged to be noticed. He did it like a habit he was ashamed of, thumb sliding under the cuff, a glance, thumb back. The face of the watch was scratched, and the minute hand trembled slightly when he breathed. There were murmurs, the kind made to fill space rather than to carry information. A question asked and answered with a shrug. A brief laugh that died as soon as it was born. The men spoke about things that belonged to ordinary days. The taste of stale bread, the way a seam had come loose on a sleeve, the fact that the water tasted different this week. Someone complained about a pen that leaked. Someone else said, without looking up, that it was always the pens that failed first. A draft moved through the room and stirred the papers on the table. The top sheet lifted at one corner, fluttered once, and settled. It was like a hand trying to get attention and deciding against it. The man at the table listened for footsteps in the hall. He listened for a knock. He listened for the particular rhythm of shoes that meant news or orders or a change in tone. But the corridor remained a long, empty throat. Silence sat there, not peaceful, not hostile, just waiting, patient as stone. He tapped the pencil against the wood once, stopped, rested it down. He folded his hands, then unfolded them. He watched a bead of water slide slowly down the inside of a metal cup and disappear at the bottom, leaving a dark trail. He watched until it was gone, as if the movement might teach him something about time. The lamp flickered again. In that moment of brief darkness, he felt the room tighten, every man holding his breath in the same shared unconscious motion. And then the light returned and they all pretended they hadn't done it. No one said what they were all thinking. No one said, "It should have happened already." A distant sound reached them then, faint enough to be doubted. Not a shout, not an alarm, just a low, steady shift in the air, like something far away being moved into position. The man at the table looked at the clock again, and for the first time all night the second hand seemed to move with purpose. Not faster, just forward. And there suddenly wasn't much of it left. A little later, how much later was hard to say because the room had its own weather now, the door finally opened with the soft reluctance of swollen wood. No one turned their head quickly. They did it the way people do when they've taught themselves not to seem eager. Eyes first, then faces, then shoulders following a heartbeat after. A man stepped in and paused with his hand still on the knob, as if he'd walked into a place where sound could shatter. He didn't bring drama with him. He brought a damp smell, a faint trace of cold air, and the look of someone who had been moving through corridors that never ended. Behind him, somewhere deeper in the building, a typewriter started again. The keys struck in a steady rhythm, too fast for careful writing, too slow for panic. The sound was oddly comforting for a moment, until it wasn't. It made the silence around it feel deliberate, arranged. The newcomer set a folder on the table, not thrown, not slammed, just placed, aligned with the edge the way the pencil had been aligned, the way the boots were aligned, the way everything had been arranged to convince the room it still had control. "Coffee?" someone asked, out of habit. The words came automatically, like a ritual response to any arrival. The man shook his head. His mouth tightened in a way that suggested the refusal had nothing to do with coffee. He took off his cap, held it at his side, and for a second the gesture made him seem younger. Then he straightened and the youth vanished again. Outside the window, night pressed its face to the glass. Somewhere beyond it there was movement, shapes passing, vehicles shifting, men walking without speaking. It was too dark to see clearly, but you could sense the structure of it. Lines forming and dissolving, the careful choreography of preparation. Inside, routine continued with stubborn discipline. A kettle was poured, a cup was rinsed. A man folded a blanket that didn't need folding. Another rewound a length of cord around his hand, then unwound it, then rewound it again, as if his fingers needed something to do to keep his mind from running. On the wall, the map's edges curled slightly where damp had softened the paper. Pins marked positions with tiny heads that caught the lamplight like eyes. Someone had drawn pencil lines, faint, erasable paths that looked neat and harmless until you imagined them as movement. A voice in the corner began reciting numbers quietly. Not a chant, not a prayer, just the low murmur of someone checking and rechecking a list. He stopped, started again from the beginning, then stopped. Each time he reached the end, there was no relief. The end didn't mean completion. It meant the list was still there. The man at the table finally opened the folder. The paper inside was clean, crisp, and too official to belong in a room that smelled of wool and metal. He read without moving his lips. His eyes traveled down the page with a practiced calm that didn't reach his hands. There was a pause where the building seemed to hold itself in place. Then a chair shifted, a fraction. Someone else leaned forward, as if leaning could bring the moment closer. But nobody spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was crowded with things not said. Beyond the walls, the wartime world persisted the way it always did, through routine. Somewhere nearby, a sentry walked his line, boots striking the same stones in the same pattern. Somewhere else, a truck engine coughed and settled into a steady idle. A lamp was extinguished in another room. You could tell by the way the light through the cracks under the door changed, thinning slightly. The young runner, still checking his watch like a guilty habit, made himself busy with a stack of blank forms. He aligned them, squared the corners, tapped the stack against the table twice and then once more, softer. He looked up as if expecting to be reprimanded for the noise. No one looked at him. No one had the spare attention. The man who'd entered stood with his cap in his hand, eyes on the table, waiting for someone to acknowledge the thing he had delivered. Outside, a thin wind pushed rain against the window, light and intermittent, more a suggestion than a storm. It sounded almost gentle, the kind of sound that belonged to a normal night. Someone trying to be useful said, "We'll have time." He didn't say it with certainty. He said it like a phrase he'd heard others use, like something you said to keep the air from collapsing. The man at the table didn't respond. He turned one page, then another. His finger traced a line of text as if to make sure it stayed real. In the corner, the lamp flickered again, and the shadows rearranged themselves on the walls. Each change subtle, each change unnoticed, the way a normal life shifts into something else without announcing it. A distant sound rose and fell beyond the building, like a door closing far away, or a vehicle changing gears, or something heavy being moved into place. It was hard to identify, which made it worse. The mind tried to name it, failed, and left it there as a weight. The man at the table finally looked up, not at the folder, not at the map, at the clock. His gaze held on it for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost careful, as if volume might make the truth more dangerous. "Not much longer," he said. The sound came again, closer this time. Or perhaps it only felt closer because they were listening for it now. It was still nothing you could point to. No siren, no shout. Just a faint irregularity in the background of the night, like a rhythm missing a beat. Someone tilted his head unconsciously, the way you do when a familiar machine begins to sound slightly wrong. A man near the window frowned, then relaxed his face as if embarrassed by the reaction. He pulled the curtain back an inch, peered into the darkness, and let it fall closed again. Whatever he saw, or didn't see, wasn't worth mentioning. Not yet. At the table, the folder lay open, its pages now marked by the pressure of fingers that lingered too long on certain lines. The man reading paused at one paragraph, reread it, then moved on without comment. If there was something there that didn't fit, he didn't give it the satisfaction of being acknowledged. The young runner finally stopped checking his watch. He stared at it for a long moment, thumb resting on the cracked glass, then slid it back under his sleeve as if tucking away a bad thought. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, boots squeaking faintly against the floor. He froze, listening to see if the sound had drawn attention. It hadn't. In the corridor, footsteps passed without stopping. Different shoes, a different rhythm. Not for them. The building exhaled as the steps faded away. Someone mentioned a delay in supplies. Nothing dramatic, just a shipment that hadn't arrived when expected. The comment floated in the room, met with a nod, then sank without leaving a trace. Delays happened. Everyone knew that. War was full of them. A pen scratched across paper, paused, scratched again. The writer crossed out a word and replaced it with another that meant almost the same thing. The change felt important in the moment. It felt like control. Near the map, a man adjusted a pin that had tilted slightly in the soft paper. He straightened it, pressed it deeper, then hesitated and pulled it back out a fraction. He stepped away, satisfied, as if the adjustment had corrected something larger than a piece of cork. The lamp's flame steadied, then dipped again. Each flicker drew the eye despite everyone's effort not to stare. The light seemed thinner now, stretched, as if it were being asked to cover more than it could manage. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sudden absence of its soft tapping made the silence sharper. In the distance, an engine cut out. Another started, hesitated, then settled into a low, steady hum. The sound threaded its way through the walls and into the room, vibrating faintly in the metal legs of the table. A voice, older, tired, said, "It's probably nothing." He didn't say what it was. No one asked. The man by the window rubbed a clear patch in the glass with his sleeve and leaned in again. This time he stayed there longer. His shoulders tensed slightly, then loosened. He stepped back and shook his head. A small, dismissive motion meant as much for himself as for anyone else. "Just shadows," he said, though no one had accused him of seeing anything else. A thin crack echoed somewhere. Wood settling maybe, or a distant door closing harder than intended. Several heads lifted at once, then lowered again when nothing followed. The shared movement felt almost rehearsed. At the table, the reader reached the end of the document. He didn't close the folder. He let it rest open, palms flat on either side, as if holding it in place. His eyes stayed on the paper, but his focus drifted. You could tell by the way his breathing changed, shallow for a moment, then carefully evened out. The runner cleared his throat softly, then decided against speaking. He took a step back, then another, positioning himself near the door the way he'd been taught. Ready, but not expecting to be used. Time stretched again, elastic and unreliable. Minutes felt like placeholders, objects set down while waiting for the real thing to arrive. Someone laughed quietly at a remark that hadn't been intended as a joke. The sound was too sharp and it died quickly, leaving an awkward hollow behind it. No one filled the space. They let it sit. Far away, something heavy shifted. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to register as a change. A few men noticed it. You could see it in their faces. The brief calculation, the quick dismissal. The man at the table finally closed the folder. The sound of it was soft, final in a way that didn't match the moment. "We're still within margin," he said, more to the room than to anyone in particular. No one challenged him, no one asked what happened when the margin disappeared. The clock on the wall marked another minute, and this time everyone heard it. No one said anything. They were still early. That was the problem. The room felt smaller now, though nothing had moved. Chairs were closer together, the ceiling lower. Even the air seemed compressed, carrying sound farther than it should have. A cough at the far end of the table traveled like a signal, drawing brief glances that retreated just as quickly. Someone checked a watch again. This time it wasn't hidden. The motion was deliberate, almost defiant, as if acknowledging time openly might force it to behave. He didn't announce what he saw. He didn't need to. The act alone was enough. The man at the table stood for the first time that night. The chair legs protested softly against the floor. He rested his hands on the tabletop, leaning forward just enough to suggest engagement, not urgency. His eyes moved from face to face, lingering nowhere. Outside, the engine noise faded, not abruptly, just thinning, dissolving into something quieter. The absence it left behind was worse. Silence arrived, heavier than sound ever had. A runner passed in the corridor, this one moving faster, boots striking unevenly. He didn't stop. The rhythm of his steps receded and then vanished, leaving behind the uncomfortable certainty that movement was happening elsewhere. The man by the map noticed that one of the pencil lines had smudged. He rubbed at it with his thumb, then with the edge of his sleeve. The mark lightened but didn't disappear. He stared at it longer than necessary, as if the faint gray ghost of the line might change if watched closely enough. Communications should be steady, someone said, not loudly. It wasn't reassurance. It was maintenance, keeping a sentence alive so it wouldn't rot in silence. A reply came from the shadows near the wall. They are. The word are hung there, fragile, not will be, not have been, just are, balanced on the present moment like a coin on its edge. The lamp flickered again, longer this time. The flame bent, thinned, then recovered. During the darkness, no one moved. When the light returned, several men realized they had been holding their breath and released it carefully, quietly, as if afraid oxygen itself might make noise. The clock advanced another minute. The young runner shifted closer to the door. No one told him to. It was instinct now, drilled into muscle and bone. He stood with his back straight, eyes forward, hands still, ready to be sent, though no destination had been named. A voice, measured, practiced, began listing times, windows, estimates. Each number was delivered cleanly, stripped of emotion. They sounded safe when spoken aloud, like measurements on a ruler. But the gaps between them, the spaces where uncertainty lived, were impossible to ignore. At the window, the curtain stirred again. The man there didn't touch it this time. He watched the movement as if the fabric might reveal something by itself. Outside, shapes passed where shapes had passed before. Too orderly to be random, too quiet to draw attention. "Any update?" someone asked. The question was neutral, almost bored. It was the kind of question that belonged to ordinary operations, to nights where nothing broke the pattern. "Not yet," came the answer. The kettle, forgotten, let out a thin, wounded whistle. Someone hurried to silence it, lifting it from the heat and setting it aside. The interruption felt intrusive now, almost rude. The smell of hot metal lingered, sharp and unwelcome. A chair scraped again, this time louder. The man who moved it froze, then settled slowly, as if easing himself back into alignment with the room. No one commented. Everyone noticed. The man at the table glanced at the door, just once. It was a small thing, but it shifted the balance. Eyes followed his movement, then pretended they hadn't. A pause opened up, longer than the others. It stretched until it felt intentional, as if someone somewhere were choosing not to act. "We can still," a voice began, then stopped. No one asked him to finish. The incomplete thought dissolved, leaving behind a residue of possibility that made the air feel charged. The map creaked faintly as the paper settled against the wall. One pin, the one that had been adjusted earlier, tilted again. No one reached for it this time. Another distant sound arrived. Closer now, clearer. Still not identifiable. Still deniable. Just enough to suggest that pieces were moving, slots filling, steps being taken beyond the reach of this room. The man at the table checked the clock once more. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A subtle shift forward, weight transferring. "This is the window," he said quietly. He didn't explain what the window was. He didn't say what would happen when it closed. The room absorbed the words without reaction. No rush. No sudden flurry of motion. Just the quiet recognition that the space between now and later had narrowed to something you could almost measure with your hands. Outside, the wind rose briefly, then fell. Inside, no one moved to stop what was already in motion. It didn't feel like a moment. That was the strange part. There was no signal, no shift dramatic enough to mark it as different from the minutes that came before. No raised voices, No sudden movement. If someone had been asked later when it happened, they wouldn't have been able to answer. They would have named a range of time, a stretch, an approximation. The man at the table reached for the folder again, then stopped halfway. His hand hovered, fingers slightly curled before settling back onto the wood. The decision, if it could even be called that, passed without ceremony. In the corridor, a door closed. Not slammed, just closed. The sound was muted by distance, softened by walls, but it landed anyway, final in a way that was impossible to explain. The runner near the door felt it before he understood it. A tightening in the chest, a subtle readiness that no longer waited for permission. He straightened, then realized there was nowhere to go yet. He remained where he was, posture now more rigid, like a statue installed too early. Someone near the map inhaled as if about to speak. The breath caught. He exhaled slowly instead, eyes never leaving the paper. The pencil lines were still there. The pins still marked their places. Nothing on the wall acknowledged that the meaning of those marks had shifted. The clock advanced another minute. No one commented. Outside, the low hum returned. Not louder, not faster, just present again, like something that had crossed a threshold and settled into its role. The vibration crept through the building, faint but undeniable now. Cups on the table trembled almost imperceptibly. The lamp's flame leaned in one direction and stayed there. A message arrived, not carried by urgency, not announced. A slip of paper was passed from one hand to another, then placed on the table. It didn't interrupt anything because nothing was being interrupted anymore. It belonged. The man at the table read it once. Then again, he nodded. Not to anyone, not in agreement, just in acknowledgement. He folded the paper carefully, aligning the edges, and placed it beneath the folder, as if tucking it away might contain what it represented. "That's noted," he said. The words were neutral, administrative. They could have applied to anything. Someone shifted in his chair and realized, too late, that the option to stand up and object had passed somewhere behind them. The realization came without panic. Just a quiet understanding, like noticing you've missed a step halfway up a staircase but continuing anyway because turning back would be worse. At the window, the man who had watched the darkness all night no longer checked for movement. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, eyes forward. Whatever he might have seen earlier no longer mattered. The outside world had committed itself. A final check was made. Not aloud, not formally. A glance at the clock, a glance at the door, a glance at the map. All the necessary symbols consulted, all of them unchanged, all of them now irrelevant. The kettle, forgotten again, had gone cold. Somewhere deeper in the building a switch was thrown. You could feel it more than hear it. A subtle realignment of systems. A readiness that no longer waited for instruction. The man at the table sat down. That was it. Not an order. Not a command. Just the act of sitting. The posture of someone who understood that standing no longer served a purpose. The room didn't react. It didn't need to. The line had been crossed quietly, without witnesses, without language capable of recording it. From this point on, everything would continue forward, whether anyone in the room followed or not. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The room settled into a stillness so complete it felt deliberate, engineered, breathing slowed. Even the men who had learned to mask nerves found nothing left to adjust. Hands rested where they were placed. Backs stayed straight or slouched exactly as before. The small negotiations people made with their bodies, shift, scratch, lean, correct, simply stopped, as if motion itself had been quietly discouraged. The clock continued, but no one looked at it anymore. Time had detached from measurement. It was no longer something you tracked. It was something you endured. Outside, the hum deepened. Not louder, deeper, as if whatever produced it had found its final position and no longer needed to search. The vibration traveled through the floor now, faint but present, a reminder that the world beyond the walls had not paused out of courtesy. Somewhere in the building, a telephone rang once. It stopped before anyone could reach it. No one remarked on that. The lamp burned steadily at last. Its flame stretched thin and obedient. Shadows no longer shifted. They clung to the walls like stains, fixed in place. The map looked flatter somehow, drained of suggestion. Its lines no longer pointed anywhere. They simply existed. The young runner near the door swallowed and focused on the grain of the wood in front of him. He traced a knot with his eyes, memorizing its shape. He didn't know why. It felt important to remember something exactly as it was. A man near the table adjusted his cuff, then stopped halfway through the motion and let his hand fall. The gesture felt unnecessary now. Appearance had lost its urgency. The air was warm, too warm for the hour. Someone noticed it distantly, the way you notice the weight of a blanket just before sleep. The smell of metal lingered, mixed with old paper and damp fabric. It was the smell of work paused mid-sentence. No one spoke because language had become inefficient. There were no instructions left that could alter direction, no warning that could arrive in time to matter. Words would only mark the moment, and no one wanted to give it that dignity. At the window, the darkness outside was no longer empty. It had depth now, layers, movement without urgency, order without sound. The man there didn't lean closer. He didn't need to. Whatever was happening had already accounted for observation. A faint click echoed somewhere, soft, mechanical, followed by another and another, spaced evenly. Each sound was small. Each one felt permanent. The man at the table closed his eyes briefly, not in resignation, not in fear, just long enough to separate what had been done from what was about to follow. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, unfocused, resting somewhere beyond the room. A chair creaked under a slow shift of weight. The sound seemed impossibly loud, then vanished. No one reacted. The runner felt a pressure behind his eyes, the urge to blink hard, to reset himself. He resisted it. He wanted to see whatever came next without interruption, even if he didn't yet understand what that meant. Outside, the wind rose again, not sharp, not violent. It moved along the building's face like a hand testing a surface, then passed on. Somewhere farther away, something responded in kind. A low answer, a confirmation. Inside, the room waited. This waiting was different from before. Earlier, waiting had been filled with options, however faint. Now it was clean, empty of alternatives. Waiting not for instruction, but for arrival. The clock marked another minute. No one counted. The lamp hummed softly, almost imperceptibly, as if straining to remain useful. The flame narrowed further, steady and unwavering, refusing to flicker now that it mattered most. The man by the map looked at it one last time. He didn't search for meaning. He didn't correct anything. He simply acknowledged it. The way you acknowledge a photograph after the moment it captured has already passed. Breaths aligned unconsciously. In, out. Slower now, as if the room itself were breathing. Far away, but no longer distant enough to deny. Something shifted into its final configuration. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough to close the remaining space. No alarm sounded. No orders were given. The men remained where they were, suspended between what still looked like an ordinary night and what could no longer be stopped. Time held its breath with them, and then it refused to move forward. The silence deepened until it felt like pressure, not the kind that crushed, but the kind that pressed evenly from all sides, leaving no direction to lean toward. The room existed inside that pressure now, sealed off from the rest of the night. Even sound seemed reluctant to enter. No one checked the door anymore, no one listened for footsteps. The expectation of interruption had expired. Outside, the hum resolved into something steadier, more deliberate, not louder, not faster, simply complete. Whatever had been assembling beyond the walls no longer needed adjustment. It had reached its final shape. Inside, a man inhaled and held the breath longer than necessary. He released it slowly, carefully, as if afraid of setting something in motion. Others followed without realizing it. A shared rhythm emerged, quiet, restrained, involuntary. The clock's second hand advanced, paused briefly against resistance that didn't exist, then continued. The sound it made felt intrusive now, a reminder of a system still operating when everything else had already committed. The lamp's flame thinned further, a narrow spine of light. It cast shadows that no longer resembled anything familiar. They were abstract now, stripped of identity, clinging to corners and edges as if waiting for permission to disappear. The runner by the door felt his pulse in his throat. Not racing, measured, steady. He focused on it, counting silently, grounding himself in something that still followed rules. A faint vibration passed through the floor, gentle, almost apologetic. Cups rattled once and settled. Dust shifted along the window frame. No one reacted. Reaction required surprise, and surprise had been used up. The man at the table placed both hands flat on the wood. He didn't speak. He didn't look at anyone. His posture wasn't tense anymore. It was fixed. Final. Somewhere far away, a sound began that might have been the start of something larger, or might have been nothing at all. It lingered at the edge of perception, just clear enough to be felt, just vague enough to be denied. No one denied it. The room understood, without discussion, that this was the last quiet it would know, not because noise was imminent, but because waiting had reached its limit. Outside, the night no longer shifted. It held. Inside, the men remained suspended, between breath and breath, between second and second, aware that the moment they were standing in would soon be unrecognizable. Nothing had happened yet. Everything was already too close. Time stayed exactly where it was.